Hi, I'm Spence Southall at Action Sports Medicine. Today we're going to be talking about patella tendonitis. When you hear the word tendonitis, what you want to think of is an inflammation of a tendon. And in this case, it's the patella tendon. What the patella tendon does is it attaches the quadriceps muscle to your kneecap and then to the lower half of your leg. And what it does is it helps extend your knee. What we'll see a lot of times is an overuse injury with patella tendonitis. So in runners, a lot of cases in people who are doing physical therapy. So what you need to realize is that because it's an overuse injury, the way we treat it is with rest. Rest, ice, and anti-inflammatory medicines such as ibuprofen. Now before you start taking your medication, it's important to talk to your doctor and to take the medication as it's prescribed. Again, with patella tendonitis, rest, ice, and ibuprofen. From Action Sports Medicine, I'm Spence Southall.